There is a word that appeared in Bernie Sanders' speeches for 40 years. Not a slogan, not a tagline, a specific word in a specific sentence said with such consistency across 4 decades of congressional floor speeches, town halls, Senate addresses, and presidential rallies that it became inseparable from who he was. And then in 2019, it quietly disappeared. Not all at once, gradually. The kind of gradual that is easy to miss unless you are watching closely. But the timing of when it disappeared is not ambiguous. It correlates almost exactly with a single event. The event was his tax return. This is the story of one word, what it meant, when it vanished, and what that tells you about the gap between a movement and the man who built it, the son of a paint salesman. Bernie Sanders' father came to America from Poland with almost nothing. The family rented an apartment in Brooklyn's Flatbush neighborhood. Eli Sanders sold paint for a living. Young Bernie grew up understanding what tight money felt like not as an abstraction, but as the specific texture of daily life. The particular weight of knowing exactly what you cannot afford, and exactly why. By his mid-20s, he had moved to Vermont. He lost a string of early races. He was not, by most early accounts, a natural politician. What he was, it turned out, was a man with one sentence. The millionaires and billionaires have rigged the system against you. Not many sentences. That one. Said on congressional floors in the 1980s. Said in Senate chambers in the 1990s and 2000s, said at rallies that grew from small rooms to arenas, said with the same pointing finger, the same flat Brooklyn cadence, the same unblinking intensity, whether he was winning or losing, whether anyone was paying attention or not. For 40 years, that sentence was the entire argument. Note the precision of it, not just billionaires, millionaires. And billionaires, both words, both classes, both specifically named as the people who had taken what working Americans were owed. He said it so often it stopped sounding like a political position and started sounding like a fact of nature. And then, in 2016, something changed. Not in the speech, in the audience. 3 million people and $27. The 2016 presidential campaign was not supposed to be what it became. Bernie Sanders entered the Democratic primary as a long-shot candidate, a Democratic socialist senator from a small state, without establishment support, without major donor networks, without the infrastructure that serious presidential campaigns are assumed to require. What he had was the sentence. And it turned out that in 2016, after decades of wage stagnation and financial crisis and the specific bitterness of watching institutions bail out the people who had broken them, the sentence was exactly what a very large number of Americans had been waiting to hear from someone who actually meant it. 3 million people donated to his campaign. The average contribution was $27. Not PAC money, not bundled donor money, not the kind of check you write because a lobbyist asked you to. $27 from people who genuinely believed, that this was the one politician in Washington who was not in it for himself. He raised over $230 million on that premise, and then the campaign suspended in June 2016. And in the 60 days that followed, something happened that not one of those 3 million donors saw coming. The 60 days. The rallies ended, the crowds went home, and Bernie Sanders returned to Vermont, but not to the same Vermont he had left. Within weeks of suspending the campaign, he signed a book deal. Our Revolution, A Future to Believe in, would be published in November 2016, 5 months. This after the last rally. The financial disclosures that followed told a very specific story. In 2016, the same year he was still telling audiences he was fighting the millionaires and billionaires on their behalf, Sanders reported income of approximately $391,000, more than double his Senate salary alone. Then 2017 arrived, and the book royalties came in full. He reported income that year of $1,061,000, over $1 million in a single year. The man who had spent 40 years building his entire political identity on the premise that he was not a millionaire, that he was not one of them, that he was fighting for the people locked outside the system, had crossed the threshold he had been pointing at since the Reagan administration. By his own 4-decade standard, he was now one of the people the sentence described. The Lake House. In August 2016, while the book money was being negotiated, 2 months after the campaign suspended, Sanders purchased a lakefront vacation home in North Hero, Vermont, on Lake Champlain. Purchase price, approximately $575,000. A third property, He already had his primary home in Burlington and a residence in Washington. Now he had a vacation home on the water, quiet streets, mountain views across the lake, the kind of place that real estate listings describe as retreat style, the kind of place typically owned by the exact people he had been describing as the enemy for 40 years. 3 months from the last rally to the third home, the campaign suspended in June, the lake house closed in August, the book deal already in motion. His net worth in 2015 had been approximately $700,000. By 2019, it had grown to $2.5 million, a 3.5 times increase in 4 years, driven almost entirely by book income generated by a campaign funded by people who gave $27 each. None of it is illegal. But here is what is worth sitting with. He kept giving the same speeches, same stages, same crowds, same sentence about the millionaires and the billionaires having too many homes and too much distance from how real people lived, while he was cashing those checks. The charter jets. By the 2020 campaign, something else had changed. In 2016, there is video of Sanders boarding a Southwest Airlines flight in coach. No entourage, no charter, just him and a boarding pass. His campaign made a quiet point of it at the time. This, the implication was clear, is what authenticity looks like. The 2020 FEC campaign filings showed approximately $297,000 spent on private charter jet travel. Think about what that number means in context. This is the campaign of a man who had called climate change the greatest threat facing humanity. His exact phrase, used in Senate chambers, on debate stages, in interview after interview throughout his career. The man who co-sponsored the Green New Deal. The man who had specifically cited the carbon footprint of the wealthy as part of his environmental argument. One charter flight coast to coast produces roughly the carbon equivalent of what 250 average Americans generate in an entire year. The campaign's answer was scheduling demands. Presidential primaries require travel across multiple states in compressed windows. Fair enough. Campaigns do have brutal logistics. But here is the problem with that answer. He ran a presidential campaign in 2016. He flew commercial. He made it work. What changed between 2016 and 2020 was not the schedule. What changed was that he had become wealthy. And the $27 donors who funded those flights had not donated to charter a private jet. They had donated because they believed in a man who seemed to mean what he said. $13 in hell. In July 2019, the Washington Post published a story about the people working inside the campaign. Sanders' 2020 presidential campaign organizers were paid a flat annual salary of approximately $36,000. On paper, a reasonable entry-level figure. In practice, these were people working campaign schedules. Long days, constant travel, 7-day weeks. When journalists calculated effective hourly pay against the hours those schedules actually required, the number they arrived at was approximately $13 an hour. On the campaign to elect a man whose signature domestic policy position, the centerpiece of his economic platform, was a $15 federal minimum wage. His own organizers, the people knocking on doors and making calls and believing in the message, being paid below the wage he was promising the rest of the country. His campaign manager publicly acknowledged the situation. Sanders said he would ensure staff received $15. The acknowledgement confirmed the original reporting. 4 things now on the table. A book deal signed within weeks of a campaign funded by $27 donations, a $575,000 lake house purchased within months of the suspension, $297,000 in private charter jets while giving speeches about the existential moral urgency of reducing carbon, campaign organizers making $13 an hour while he told the country $15 was the ethical minimum, and running through all of it, the word that disappeared. Political observers who had covered Sanders closely began noticing something shifting in his language around 2019. The formulation he had used for 40 years, millionaires and billionaires, had been precise for a reason. Not just billionaires, both words, both classes. The millionaires specifically named alongside the billionaires as the people who had captured the system at the expense of everyone else. Starting around the time his income crossed the $1 million threshold, the word millionaires began its quiet exit. Billionaires remained. The anger at billionaires remained. The pointed finger remained. But millionaires, the word that would have described him by his own 40-year standard, started appearing less. Then less again. then essentially not at all in his signature formulation. The timing was not random. In April 2019, he released 10 years of tax returns and was asked directly about his millionaire status. His answer? I wrote a best-selling book. If you write a best-selling book, you can be a millionaire too. Sit with that for a moment. A man who had told working people for 40 years that the millionaires had stolen their future, whose entire political identity rested on the premise that ordinary people could not get ahead because the game was rigged against them, was now telling those same people that the path was straightforward. Write a best-selling book. Most of the people who gave him $27 do not have the platform that makes a book a bestseller. Most of them do not have the name recognition that commands a seven-figure advance. The advice is not advice. It is dismissal wearing the shape of inspiration. It is the sound of a man who just joined a class explaining to the people still outside it that the door was always open. They simply had not tried hard enough to walk through. Here is what the documented record shows. Bernie Sanders spent 40 years building a movement on a single argument, that the millionaires and billionaires had rigged the system, and that he was the one voice in Washington willing to say so. 3 million people believed him enough to give $27. He used the platform that money built to generate a book deal. He used the book deal to become a millionaire. He bought a lake house. He chartered private jets on a campaign about climate justice. His own organizers made $13 an hour while he campaigned for a $15 minimum wage. And the word millionaires, the word that had been in the sentence since the Reagan administration, the word that described exactly what he had become, quietly left the speeches at precisely the moment it would have applied to him. This is not accidental hypocrisy. Accidental hypocrisy is when a man says one thing and simply ends up living another way without quite noticing. This was an adjustment, documented, timed, specific. The word did not drift out of his vocabulary. It was removed, after a specific event, at a specific moment. The event was his tax return. The moment was when the word stopped describing his enemies and started describing him. He grew up in a small apartment in Flatbush. His father sold paint. He told working people for 40 years that their enemy had a name. And then he became that name, and quietly rewrote the sentence so it no longer included him. So, where does this land for you? Does the documented record change how you think about Sanders and the movement he built? Or do you think the book income and the lake house and the charter jets are separate from the political argument, things that don't undermine the substance of what he was saying? Drop your honest take in the comments. This is the kind of story where people land in genuinely different places, and I want to know how you're reading it. Subscribe if you're new here. We follow the money, the documents, and the timelines because that's where the real story almost always lives. Hit like if this gave you a clearer picture of what the record actually shows. One word, 40 years, gone at exactly the right moment. Now you know why.